How's it going, everybody? Well, here we are again for another casual conversation. And today we're talking about the English Standard Version. I don't know if that's picking up there, but in particular, this edition right here is actually my, it's actually a Pitt Minion. You know, I kind of really love the Pitt Minions. It's kind of my thing. But anyway, this in brown, this is a calf split. I cheaped out, but honestly, guys, if you can get the goatskin, get it, but the calf split's not that much different. But anyway, put that aside. Let's talk about it. The ESV. You know what's funny is the ESV. I've always been really a New American Standard guy, and the ESV kind of has this rivalry with the New American Standard. And it's funny is you know, they're really so similar. They're really, really close. They're not that different from each other. And a lot of times, I told a guy this, which is a lot of times, you know, you might be reading, you know, if I didn't have the Bible open in front of me or I wasn't really familiar with the passage, to be honest, if a guy was reading from the ESV or the New American Standard, it would be hard for me to tell them apart because that's how close they really are. Super close. But there are some differences between them, and I just thought I would give my thoughts about it. Like, what do I think about it? Do I like it? Do I dislike it? You know, I guess let's just get into it. The ESV a lot of times gets a bad rap among some circles as being what's called a Calvinist only Bible. You know, that it's only used by Reformed guys. Now, there is some truth to that in the sense that it's mainly, I would say that the biggest people that prefer it, or the biggest camp that loves it, would be Reformed guys, right? Calvinist. I'm not that, but that's not why I don't. Just because I don't use ESV is not because I don't like that, right? So I don't have a problem with that, even though I'm not in that camp. A lot of my friends are in that camp. But it's true that most of the time Reformed guys, the Calvinists and stuff, Presbyterians, they really like the ESV. And I think I've got a theory for why that is, okay? And you know what, let me just get into it. Here's my theory, all right? This is the wild card theory. The ESV is kind of known as being more, it's a very formal translation, right, which is good, but it's kind of known as being a little more elegant than, say, the New American Standard. The New American Standard, if you're going to go into cliches and stereotypes, the New American Standard kind of gets this rap as being wooden and not super elegant, and the ESV gets a rap, gets its stereotype would be that it's more along the lines of elegance, and it's in the line of the King James, as in how the English sounds. Some people joke that it sounds, they call it Yoda-ish, because it'll swap, you know, put the verb first in a sentence. I actually don't have a problem with that at all. It's never bothered me. And actually, if you ever learn the original languages, particularly Greek, you'll find that English is what's called an SVO language, that the subject comes first, then the verb, then the object. Well, typically Greek is different. Typically in Greek, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but I'm just saying, typically in Greek, it'll start with the verb, then go to the subject, then the object, hence Yoda, you know, running that man is, you know, something like that, right? Well, the ESV tends to do that, and it's never bothered me. I think it's kind of cool, and I actually think it makes you remember verses better, personally. But at any rate, why do the Reformed guys like the ESV? And my theory is that Reformed guys tend to be very, and I mean this in the best possible way, but a little melodramatic, okay? For example, they love the church fathers. They love Calvin. They love, you know, Spurgeon. They love all these things, and they love tradition, right? Very high, you know, liturgy and things like this, and the creeds, and those are great things. I'm not disparaging those, okay? But those guys really love that, and so their emphasis for them is on like literature and beauty. And so they want a modern translation, right? Because the King James, it would be dated, so they want a modern edition, but they want it to be elegant and have that beauty. And so hence the ESV steps in, right? That's part of it. The other part is that a lot of the guys that backed it in the beginning were big in the Reformed movement. So you get guys, whether either they worked on the translation committee or they were the ones that initially backed it, right? So you got guys like J.I. Packer, John Piper, Wayne Grudem, who else? Let's see, we got Al Mohler. You know, these guys that are real big in that movement, right? And they really influential in switching to the getting the ESV going. The reason the ESV exists really is it comes from what's called the RSV, right? The Revised Standard Version. And the RSV was really popular, but what happened was they updated it in, I think, the 80s, and it was called with what's known as the NRSV. And it was a very ecumenical update, let's just put it that way. The NRSV honestly is a good translation, but it does have a problem. I think it's a problem is that it is gender neutral, right? Now, I say gender neutral in the sense a lot of people throw that term around, but I mean it in the literal sense. It is gender neutral, that it avoids gender whenever possible, which I think is a problem. It definitely can make a lot of text, interpreting a text very difficult if you're not, especially if you don't know the original language, and it can be misleading. So, at any rate, the RSV was updated and they made it into the NRSV. Well, what happened was a bunch of guys got together and they didn't like that, and they wanted to update the RSV because they loved the RSV, right? Particularly John Piper, I know, is very influential in this. But at any rate, they bought the rights to the RSV and updated it and made their own update, and that is what the ESV is. Now, to say it's just an update of the RSV, I don't think is accurate. Really, it's a fresh translation that's made in the tradition of the RSV, if I was to put a title on it, right? But it's funny, if you were to look at them, it's almost like, back to the differences between the ESV and the New American Standard, it's almost like they're cousins, right? They've got the same grandfather, more or less, because they both come from let's see, if I was to do a family tree here, you get the American Standard Version, right? And the update of the American Standard Version was the New American Standard on one side, and on the other side you have the Revised Standard Version. And then from the Revised Standard Version, you get the NRSV and the ESV. So it's almost like they're cousins, so it makes sense that they're similar, right? But at any rate, I think that's a big reason why the Reformed guys like it, is because they're Bible teachers, most of the guys, they use it. And, that makes sense. Think about it. I love Chuck Smith, right? And Chuck Smith is a guy that used the King James. So I use the King James quite a bit because I like Chuck Smith. And I'm used to, when he quotes passages or he's reading, I like to read the same version. So if you're a guy that you love John Piper, right, and he's reading out of the ESV, it would make the most sense that you'd use the ESV. Or, you go to a seminary that uses it, right? And it just makes sense. So honestly, that's just my theory about that. But let's talk about the differences, really, and what kind of sets the ESV apart. It's funny, it's funny, the things that I used to not like about the ESV actually kind of became the things that I like about it now. So it's almost, the points that I would use is, I don't want to say disparaging points, but the things that I would have brought up as a negative for the ESV have really switched and sort of become positive. What do I mean by this? Well, the ESV, for example, doesn't do italics for supplied words, and the New American Standard does. And in the past, I used to not like that because I really like the transparency of using supplied words in italics, especially if I'm doing a study. Before I knew Greek, or was familiar at least, I found it really helpful to be able to see when a word wasn't technically in the text and was supplied. And the ESV doesn't do that. And I'll admit, I used to not like that. But I found that when I'm doing just Bible reading, right? If I'm just doing just reading for the sake of just digesting and not a deep study, because I think there's a difference. Not that I turn my brain off, but when I'm just doing casual reading, that I like the ESV for that reason, because the italics would tend to distract me and pull me out sometimes. And the ESV doesn't have those, so I think it's a better reading Bible. Not to mention, as I mentioned earlier, the ESV is on the formal side, but it's slightly less formal than the NAS, right? So it tends to be more literary than, I don't like using the term literal, but it's kind of it works. It tends to be more literary. So I think that when you're reading it, it flows a lot better and it's a lot more, I would say, elegant. So that's another thing that I like about it. It's funny, like I said, I've never really used the ESV a whole lot until somewhat recently, and then from what I've used of it, I like it. But again, I'm not going to switch to it 100%, which, to be honest, I don't really follow one translation 100% anyway. You should have one that you really get to know really well, but then you should also be dipping your hand, your foot in the pond, I guess, of a bunch of others, because it keeps you from getting stuck in a rut. Sometimes it's really helpful if I'm stuck on a passage and I go, I don't know, to go grab the ESV and open it up and see how they worded it. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it might be different. It's no different than using different translations, right? So if I go and pull out the NLT, or I go and I pull out an NIV, or I go pull out sometimes even the NRSV, right? Even though I don't really like it that much, it's still useful to see what other people have to say on a passage. You know, keeps you from getting stuck in a rut. Especially if, you know, you're in a particular theological camp. You don't want to be the type of person that shuts off any other teacher because you don't like them per se, right? You can get a lot of truth from everyone. Be discerning, but you can get a lot of benefit from listening to other people, particularly those that you disagree with. You know, like I said, I'm not a Calvinist, but I've listened to lots of Calvinists, and I've learned a lot, okay? In the same way, right? So, it's really starting to rain on me here. Hopefully that's not picking up on the mic, but at any rate, the ESV, you know, like I said, there's kind of a friendly rivalry between the ESV and the NAS, and a buddy of mine, you know, he would use the ESV, and I was always joking, teasing with him about it, where we'd always joke about who had the better Bible and stuff. But, you know, at the end of the day, honestly, just being totally honest, it's a great Bible, okay? And if you use the ESV, it's fantastic. This is just my off the top of my head discussion. If you want, I've thought about doing one. I wouldn't mind doing one in the future, but a more in-depth, in particular on those passages, because I've heard a lot of people say that the ESV, since it was so heavily influenced by Reformed guys, that they tweaked certain passages to make them fit their doctrine. And if you would like to see a video about that, I would love to do one, you know, and to see if there is some truth to that. I'll go ahead and give you a hint. I don't think there is, but I'm just saying, if you'd like to see a video on that, I'd love to do it, you know. I love talking about this kind of stuff, you know. You know, one of the interesting things, I just brought this up, is just a side issue I thought was interesting. I was listening to one of the guys who was in an interview, and he was one of the main translators on the ESV committee, and he was talking about, what was it? He was talking about how long it took to make the ESV. And I think it was only about 3 years, because it kind of came out, I believe it came out in the early 2000s. And he was talking about how long it took, and only about 3 years. And I was thinking about it, and the New American Standard and the New King James, pretty much most of the other translations before that take at least on average, took about 6 years or so, right? 7 years sometimes. And the ESV took half that time. And I think part of it is, and he said this, not this, but he mentioned that the ESV was one of the first translations to really utilize email. As goofy as that sounds. And he brought up the fact, because he'd been on a couple other committees before that, where you'd have a discussion, right? And you're like, I have a question about such and such a passage. We need to talk to the world's expert about that passage. Well, you know, he lives in Oxford, England, and I'm living over here in Florida. Well, I got to write him a letter now. Put it on a plane or whatever, a ship, snail mail, takes a week or two to get to him, takes a week or two to get an answer. Now you had a month to answer one question. Versus an email, he said you could get on there and just fire off a question real quick. Not to mention that, and the fact with computers, able to utilize them more efficiently instead of having to do, you know, handwritten things, or, you know, going and grabbing an actual physical book to look up stuff, right? It's just interesting how the internet, what a incredible role it's played in Bible translations, right? But I just brought that up as an interesting thing on the side, you know, nothing crazy. But anyway, that's just my thoughts about the ESV. If you guys want to know more about it, I'd love to do a more in-depth one. That sounds like a lot of fun. You know, I like doing these casual conversations because I can just talk off the top of my head, you know, and I just love talking about this kind of stuff. But if you'd like a more in-depth video, particularly about those passages where, you know, the quote Calvinist influenced passages, let me know. I'd love to do one. So at any rate, guys, you know, read your Bibles, be faithful, attend church, you know, fellowship is key, right? So we want to be sowing in others' lives just like they would sow into us. And at the same time, read your Bibles consistently, guys. That's how you have a relationship with God. That's how he talks to you, okay, through his word. So at any rate, I hope this helped you guys out, and God bless you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.